This is the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 119. Testing. I am
Woohoo!
your, I'm your host this week, Danny Blue, and with me is Eric Isaacson
Hello.
and Mark Nadal.
Hello, but Danny, you're supposed to say testing 1, 2, 3 before the show starts. What are you talking about?
Oh, boo! Oh, the puns. Is that? I don't know what that is. That's actually, yeah. No, it's very true. But that is what we're going to be talking about today. We were talking a little bit, really just yesterday, trying to figure out what we want, like really what we wanted to talk about. Everybody seems to be into a little bit of testing stuff at the moment, so that's really just where we're gonna start. So, what I'd kind of like to do first is just kind of figure out what kind of testing worlds everybody's kind of living in at the moment. I can go first with that. So, right now at work, we're doing a lot of stuff with Angular 2. So so getting into a lot of the, the component testing and how a lot of those different things work, which I will say overall, I think is a pretty good test environment. There's some caveats and some things you have to make sure you do know, but we can start talking about some of that stuff later. And so Mark, what about you? What testing world are you currently living in?
I'm using Mocha primarily, and then more recently I've been getting into scary things like performance testing and coordination testing.
Coordination.
Ooh.
What do you mean by coordination testing?
Distributed testing. I don't even know how to explain it. Like, how many different devices can you connect to a server, and do those devices correctly reflect the state of the web app when Alice and Bob are making changes across different computers?
So you got the easy testing, huh?
Oh boy.
And for anybody that's listening that that doesn't know, Mark is the author of GunDB, and we did an episode about that a while back, which is all about distributed stuff and maintaining the correct state and all kinds of fun things. So I do recommend, if you want to know more about that stuff, that everybody go back and listen to that episode.
Or just simply open source Firebase, because that's a little bit easier than the technical terms.
Perfect. And what about you, Eric?
So lately I've been doing I was doing a little React for a while, doing testing with Enzyme and Mocha, and we did that for one project, and that was interesting. We had lots of disagreements and flame wars, obviously. Testing in JavaScript frameworks always brings that out in people. But we got the job done, and it was good. And lately now, I've been put onto a project where we're doing a Node CLI tool for internal use, and having to test more promise type of flows, generators, and promise coroutines and promise maps. And I'm really struggling with the getting the TDD piece of it, getting like unit testing versus like integration testing, because do you test the result of a promise, because a promise returns a promise, right? It doesn't return a value that you can actually look at and introspect on that. So a lot of challenges.
So I got two questions, which is, first off, what on earth is a coroutine? What are promises? What is async and await? And what is this big famous thing that people are talking about called TDD? Is that some new drug that people are taking? What is TDD?
What? No, TDD is test-driven development. These are good questions that I'm sure you know the answers to. So, but some people may not. So, yeah, test-driven development, and so it's an old concept that has been revived in recent years through Ruby community. Java has had it for a while, but it hasn't been like glamorized, I guess, in that fashion. But TDD is test-driven development, where you test something. If it breaks, then you go and you fix that code. You go back and forth with that, and there's different ways to handle that. different types of things for testing. You would have unit tests, which test individual pieces of things. You have integration tests, which are like how those small pieces integrate or work together. End-to-end tests is like you want a finished result and test that result at the end, or some action that happens. Functional testing and BDD, which is behavior-driven development, slightly different. And I guess the definitions would change. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but like of what defines that as behavior-driven or functional. So that's for those. Is that clear, or is that not correct in some way?
That's great. So how would somebody get into test-driven development if they were just getting started?
Yeah, so it's also like, how would somebody kind of get started with that, and also like why do people do it? So it's also, so also not just this is what it is, but there are reasons that some people are really big advocates of it. And what are some of those reasons?
Yeah, definitely all good questions to kind of say why people would do it, because that's the first question I asked myself. Like, why do we test this code? We just want it to run. And like, to people who have done TDD, it could sound like, like I'm crazy to even ask that question, but like, it's not, different workflows require different things. So you may not need TDD if you're working outside of an agile environment. You may use something else to test your code. You could always do like console type of ad hoc type testing for things, which is not scalable. But the reason, to get back to that, because I am going a little too far on this, is that there's several reasons. One of them is maintenance of your code and reliability of your code. So one of the challenges with TDD is it's hard to justify the amount of time that would take to do testing unless you're familiar with TDD, that it's hard to quantify it with a number and say, well, we're going to save this much time for this sprint. Because really the long-term effects of TDD is what would really affect the bottom line. So you have your ROI changed, you have less time on defects spent. So you can track some of these things with agile stuff, like doing charts to figure out, okay, well, we had this many defects last sprint, we had this many defects this sprint, kind of compare those things. But it's hard to say, hey, TDD helped us push this over the mark so that our code is that much better. So it's a challenge, right? But there is really high value in the maintenance of it. It reduces the costs, but it does increase the time. Depending on if you are a shop that already understands how to use TDD, or if you're just starting out, that time will be different.
And I wanted to expand on that just a little bit. So doing true test-driven development doesn't just mean that your code is unit tested or whatever. A lot of times in that really what that means in that process is really that you almost write your unit tests first. It's where it kind of forces you to maybe think about the technical design of a solution a little bit more right off the bat. And then a very simple example is that, so say you're going to write a function that adds a bunch of numbers together. What you would do is you would actually first, create your boilerplate, but then write your test first. Say, so you write your test first, and that test is going to fail. And then, because that when I pass in 1 and 1, it's supposed to be 2. But so right off, that's going to fail because it's not working. And then you write your code to satisfy that unit test. That's one of the big things about test-driven development. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of people like it. But it can be, at least for me, at times it can be difficult, because it's really easy with like with that very arbitrary example that I just gave. But when you have more complicated problems, or sometimes things that are going to change, it's a little bit. Sometimes it can feel like you're just spinning your wheels for the exercise of it. But,
are you guys familiar with OptiGrim?
No.
So he's in the Ruby community and a few other development communities, but he was on Ruby Rogues for a long time. a while back. And he had said something about testing that I thought was really great, was that he uses Tdd Approach for, or he did at the time, I don't know if he's still doing it, for designing code. So I found that that's been very useful. So what happens is I'll think of code a certain way if I'm not testing, get it done, do this, do that. But if I'm testing it, I'll be like, oh, I didn't think of that. And that'll change the way I actually create that method or function or whatever. And it may change the overall design if something is not testable. That's sort of a code smell that maybe I should refactor this and change this around to a different way of thinking.
Yeah, definitely. I've had that same thing too, where before I'd typically write a library and then I'd start using it. However, the imagination of how I'd use it while I'm writing the library is never as clear as when I'm actually the user using the API and using the library. But when I start with test-driven development first, it does force me into that position. And then it makes me, I'd argue, make better design decisions in terms of just the convenience of using the tool I'm building, because I have to be the user first before I am the author. And then the other thing, the biggest point for me with test-driven development, because I very grudgingly got into it, it's a necessity, but it was like, wow, why would I waste so much time writing stuff that doesn't even run in production? And then I realized, oh, well, because my code is running in production, so it should probably be tested, is the liberty to be able to change the algorithm or the logic or the if statements or the variables inside of a function when I know that I can get like a performance boost, or I know I can make something better, but I know I can change those things without the system breaking, without the fear of the system breaking, or without the unknown of the system breaking. That is a very scary thing once you've built something and it's kind of working and it's out there and you're like, oh no, I gotta like fix this bug inside of this function. But if I change it, you know, how much could go wrong versus going right?
I actually have I think a really good example of this, because this also gets into I think something else that we want to talk about is that, so because testing is good, like overall testing is a net good, but this will kind of lead into like what good tests are and how we can help make our code a bit more testable. My example of that exact situation, Mark, was I have functions that are helping me navigate a fairly significant tree structure, and it was the same thing. I made it work. So I wrote the test. So I made it work, and I wrote the test for it. So I knew that the results that I was getting out of my different methods for get children and get grandchildren and all that kind of stuff, all of that stuff was working correctly. But I had performance improvements that I needed to make. Because the tests were already there and they were passing and correct, I could do so. When I would make a change, if my test failed, I automatically knew, like you automatically know when something is wrong. And that's really what I think is the way that I try to think about some of this stuff. It's not so much, oh, I want to make sure that something works this way. It's that you want to make sure that it's not, well, it is that, but what you're really doing is you're making sure that when you make a change, you don't break something else that you didn't think about.
And that is very liberating and
Yes.
freeing, because it lets you just experiment.
Yes, it is really, really liberating is a good way to think about it. Like, I feel very secure in the changes that I've had to make versus, times when I've worked on code bases in the past that have no tests or anything like that. Everything is scary.
Yeah, and that's like with unit testing especially too, because you have smaller pieces to think about. Like when I do tests, I try and test one thing specifically for each test and not have multiple things. And that's hard, like if you're used to writing your code in giant functions.
So what testing libraries are you guys using? I'm currently using Mocha. It's decent, but I keep on having some annoying frustrations with it. I've been interested in looking at Tape by Substack. I don't know if any of you guys have used it. What are you guys using?
Eric, go ahead.
No, I have not used that. I'm interested.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm currently using I'm using Karma and Jasmine, which is what I'm using the built-in stuff that comes with Angular CLI. Which if anybody especially if anybody looked at Angular CLI a long time ago, you should definitely look at it now. It's getting better and better with each release. But yeah, so I've always been a pretty big fan of Jasmine. I know some people have some problems with the way it tries to, kind of write out like a sentence, but I've always liked it. And because I'm using Angular 2 and TypeScript, there are typings for Jasmine. There are typings for other testing frameworks too, but because of that, it helps with not having to remember exactly what methods you need to call to test stuff. So overall, I like Jasmine. I know there's Tape has been getting a decent following. I know they're oh my god, I'm just blanking. I'm just blanking on the name. Oh, but there've been quite a few proponents of Tape have been popping up. I'd say in the last maybe 6 months or something like that.
All right, I got to switch, right? So the problems I've been having with Mocha are pretty specific. Oftentimes, I'll be looking for a particular bug or a particular problem that surfaced, and I'll be editing code. And I think this maybe only applies when it's an asynchronous test. Most of my tests are. And I wind up changing some code that causes the function to crash or causes something else to be wrong. But the frustrating thing is Mocha immediately bails in that test. And as a result, I'm then switching back and forth between my code editor and Mocha and being like, why is the bug that I'm trying to fix not happening? Why is the bug I'm trying to fix not happening? What's going on? And then I realized, oh, there's just something else. So to me, that gets really frustrating because even though I know about it, now it keeps on resurfacing. So if there was ability in Mocha or in some other library that that my test would run to completion, so that way I would always know that the bug is the bug that I'm trying to fix and working on, not some other piece that I changed.
So Mocha. So hold on, I want to say so. Mocha doesn't. So if Mocha exits as soon as it hits a bug,
it's weird.
Test.
It depends upon the scenario. Sometimes it runs something to fruition. And sometimes it just bails the whole test, and I'm not quite sure the reasoning. I think in a synchronous test, I don't know, and that's where I'm not sure what's going on behind Mocha, and that's kind of the magic that I'm not able to reason about, which is then why I want to probably try out a different testing library, because I'm hoping that those other libraries will have more consistent or more transparent behavior that I know how to reason about.
So I've run into this before with asynchronous, and I'm running into more complex things now. I've had similar issues that you've been having. So let me ask you something. Are you testing what exactly are you testing?
Yeah. So here's the frustrating thing: is your test should be stateless. But because I'm building a database, I'm testing the state of the database. So that doesn't help the situation. So oftentimes it has to do, and so for people who use RxJS, I have observables or event listeners. So oftentimes, even the tests that have already completed, when I change data on the same data set that I'm testing, it'll cause. Yeah.
You have to use that first operator. Tell it to stop. So there's a first op. I know exactly what you're talking about. So you subscribe to something, and then later it keeps getting triggered, and then the result is something different than what you want to test, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a first operator, which means
Mocha? Or
this is in RX. So
okay.
RX has a first operator. So when you so before you call subscribe, just say first, and then it will only listen. It will only trigger your subscribe method the first time, and then it immediately unsubscribes.
Yeah, I'm not actually using RxJS directly. I was hoping you were saying that there's a first for testing. Now, Mocha does have a dot only, which is pretty useful because then I can narrow things down to just that one test. However, oftentimes, because databases are stateful, I need the previous tests to first save data that I'm testing, and then a subsequent test that changes or mutates the data. And as a result, then I have to have a bunch of like, if this test is already run in my observable or my event listeners, return. So that way.
This seems like a good case for generators and using like Co with Mocha. So you could do this where you have a generator that runs, and it'll yield to your it'll yield to your test, and then it'll yield to the next test when that completes. So that might be something to look into. For asynchronous code in general, though, I found stuff like Sign-On or Sin-On. I don't know how you would pronounce it, but it's really good. They have a server in there. You could stub out an entire server for a web application, or XHR requests you can stub out. And that's been really useful for like if you needed to do like an integration test with some asynchronous code. So you can stub things out using things in Jasmine, but it doesn't really do as good of a job as Sign-On. And now there's other tools too. I think you can use. I'm trying to remember. I'm struggling with promises now because the promises, they'll do these side effects inside. And if you don't, you have to catch it at the end, because if you catch too early, as I've found out, we have like a promises guy here who's really good, and he's like, it's the ghosts of promises past, where you do a catch too early and it swallows up your errors. And so it's been really struggle trying to get promises to work for me, and generators inside of promises, and doing promise, .all type behavior, which was deprecated in the spec, but doing it with Bluebird. So very, very strange things happening, but definitely check out Sign-On for asynchronous stuff in general.
So really quickly, going back to the original question, because it sounds like you touched on it slightly that I had, which is, I'm guessing the problem is that if I have an assert error or an expect that is incorrect, it will continue running some of the other tests, maybe or maybe not. Or if I have something that crashes inside of a callback, only the callback stops running everything else, but the rest of the test completes. Versus if my do you get what I'm saying? Because you said that generators might help with that, or no? Because generators are going to help us sequence.
Yeah, it's for synchronous code though, for generators. So I had to actually use some hack that Bluebird helps you with, using generators inside of promises. So I think the way that the generator spec is and the way that the promises spec is, they don't work so well together natively. So I think Bluebird helped me with that, which is a library for promises. But if you need async await is still very new. Like that's not in Node proper. It is in Nightly, I think 7.1, 7.2. So if you're testing like async await does asynchronous behavior flow like that, where you'll have an async function and then it'll await until the result happens, or that runs, and then it'll run the next thing. So it depends on your flow. If you have an asynchronous flow, that's probably better. But with promises, and you chain the promises, like you'll want promises to resolve sometimes in a synchronous flow altogether, like where, if one doesn't work, then I don't want anything to happen. And that's where promise all and promise map help. But don't use promise all because it's deprecated now. I don't know if that's like helpful or too much on a tangent.
Sorry for diving into a detail of problems. I was hoping it'd be applicable, but maybe not always. So shifting gears then, there's a lot more than just unit tests. There's a lot more than just what's after that? Integration tests. I mentioned coordination tests, performance tests. What are kind of the more advanced forms of testing that you guys are using?
I don't know if I would call it more advanced, but just different testing. So I guess you would call would you call integration and end-to-end tests like the same thing? Like
yeah, you could argue either way, right? It depends.
I would
Like
specifically
integration
ask
might be like one or two things together, and an end-to-end would be like a full cycle of something.
Yeah.
But you can argue it different ways, sure.
Would end-to-end necessarily require multiple devices?
Well, so it would potentially require multiple devices so that it would. So if it is a web app, for example, it would require, and you were actually testing result, and you were actually making sure that the correct network requests were going out. I don't really know. I don't know as much about end-to-end tests, specifically about mocking, because that's one of the things in unit tests that becomes the most frustrating for almost anybody, is that eventually you have to stub out an HTTP request of some sort, and those are always annoying to do. I don't really know how that exists in end-to-end tests. To me, it's like you call like the user clicky tests or whatever, where you actually, so if you have a form in your unit test, you like so specifically in Angular world, if you're using like reactive forms, you don't even have to render the template. You can do it all with your observables and make sure the correct values are coming back and all that kind of stuff. But for the end-to-end, it would actually be, okay, the browser opens, loads the view, actually enters some text into all of these different fields, and then you expect something to happen. At that point, after clicking, if it was login or something like that, really, like, you would have to hit some sort of a login service or something, or at least something to let you something to resolve and return so that you could continue through the flow. So I don't know if you could call that multiple devices, because it does potentially require other hardware somewhere.
I mean, for that, you could do two things, right? If you need like an integration test, to me is like a more simpler way to do this, where you're taking one functionality where you're let's say doing an XHR request, right? Maybe an image source or something changes. And so you need to do that. You can stub that out and say, if this particular, like using sign-on, right? You can stub out an entire server. You can do requests with sign-on. I think Angular 1 had some tool you could do where you stub out the HTTP requests. I don't know if 2 has something like that.
No, Angular has a similar thing.
So you could do that, or if you needed the whole full end-to-end, I would suggest doing something like Sauce Labs has, where you run Selenium to do all that for you, to pass that stuff in and do more BDD type of testing.
Yeah. So we're using so the CLI ships with a protractor configured, and that's what it does. It uses the Selenium WebDriver.
Yeah, which is good. It's just you got to make sure that the DOM is not constantly changing its IDs and classes and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, it depends on how you write. So like when I think of an integration or an end-to-end test, that's really what I think of, which is actually when you have, in this case, the WebDriver is the user interacting with your code. Well, in this case, this is also kind of specific to GUIs. So Mark, I imagine this is not the same for you, where there's not a GUI that's being interacted with. So I guess your integration test would be slightly different. Not slightly, quite a bit different.
Well, it can include making sure the UI is updating correctly, but I'll jump in here because this has been a huge fascination of mine for a long time. Have you guys ever heard, so quick side rant to introduce the complexities of the subject. Have you guys heard of a guy named Kyle Kingsbury? He goes by Afer online. He's written a bunch of pretty popular articles on database testing called the Call Me Maybe Jepsen series or Jepsen tests.
The name sounds really familiar, but that's all I can really say.
So he's a lot of fun because he goes to like MongoDB and these other databases, and he sets up like 5 different database servers and then performs a series of tests to make sure that the databases behave the way that they should. And typically they don't, which is part of the reason why I was inspired to work on Gun, because it's like, wow, this guy's really coming in and like actually testing these giants. So a huge inspiration that I've had is, okay, how can I actually test the system, right? Whether that be a login box on your actual service, or whether, you know, data is actually correctly shows up on different devices. And you might want to go even further, like you're saying, with end-to-end. You might not want to even make sure that the data is getting transferred. You might want to make sure that the data is rendering in your application correctly. So we could not find any tool that that did this or made it easy for us to do this. So we wound up building our own tool called Panic. And it's really awesome because it integrates with Mocha and QUnits, I think any promise-based testing library. And it's kind of trippy because this is what you can do. You can write your tests on the server in test files. Those test files will get delivered down to the browser using Selenium or something like that, or just manually opening up a browser. The browser will run the tests that are supposed to happen. So for instance, one test might be log into the service. The entire test system, like server and browser and the other browsers, will wait until that first browser has done the login. And then the next test will run, which is running on the server, which will make sure that a user has been created. And then once the user has been created, when that test completes or finishes, the next test will run, which will get delivered down to another browser. And then that browser will try and load the user and read the user on the data, make an update, and that test will finish. And then your command line, which you originally ran, the test will show all of the green check marks with Mocha, because it integrates with Mocha or any, like I said, promise-based testing library. And the trippy thing is, even if a test fails in the browser, your command line will print out the error that the browser gave to that test. So it's made our job of testing so much easier because we can design these really complicated full app, full end-to-end actual user behavior tests and make sure that they behave correctly. It's pretty exciting.
I want to try that. That sounds pretty awesome. Can you put a link to that and the database guide for testing, like some of his blog stuff or whatever?
Kingsbury.
Well, to Kyle Kingsbury. Yeah, I'll throw in a link for him. I'm also tossing the link for our testing library. The exciting thing about it is that it should be used for more than just database testing. Like I said, it should be used to test your service to make sure that your CRUD operations, your create operations, your update operations, delete operations, what have you, are working correctly.
Can you test things like testing for certificates and testing for, I guess, permissioning and things like that?
By certificates, do you mean like SSL, HTTPS?
Yeah, definitely. Like, because sometimes I'll run into that where, like, let's say a dev server doesn't have SSL, or even like trying to test an API with cores. Like,
I think
sometimes
what's
cores
going
is illegal on one side, and then you gotta look at the API and figure out why.
I think what's going to happen is if your development server doesn't have, like, if it's not HTTPS and that's what you're specifically testing, the browser is going to give an error before Selenium or your browser can even load the page automatically. So as a result, just nothing would happen, and then the test would time out and fail. However, if you're doing something like cores, yeah, you could have one browser load one domain and another browser that's all being started by Selenium load another domain, and then make sure that the operations that they're doing pass through each other. And And likely the way that it'd be tested is just that it would time out because you're not able to really catch the security errors, which has been really annoying, actually. There's some errors in Chrome that you just can't get access to, or I haven't been able to get access to. But ultimately, the test would time out, and then you'd know something went wrong. And you could probably easily console.log. Well, no, that probably wouldn't be helpful if you can't catch the error. So yes.
So I have
sorry, go ahead.
Okay. No, so I have another question tied to, I guess, that concept. So like the simple process that you gave was the browser submits, so it would be like the browser hits an API or something to create a user. The server then runs a test to make sure that the user is created, and then the browser again, or what the consumer then makes a request to make sure that they can retrieve the user. That's so like that correct based on what you said?
Yeah, let's just say and this is all one test, but it's described as a bunch of .thens or
Okay.
I think awaits. So you first say create an account in the browser, and Selenium spins that up for you, or you manually spin it up. Then .then, except for this code now is on the server, while the previous function call got delivered to the browser for you. The server then checks that the user was created, and then .then, the next piece is imagined on a different device, like a Selenium, an iOS or Android device. You try and sign into that user. So now you have a test that comprehensively sees end-to-end and perhaps even UI that everything behaved correctly, and you know for sure that your whole.
So that's interesting though. Like I would imagine this is super important for a distributed system. And like what you're doing with the promises .then, I'm immediately thinking when you're saying this one test does everything, like whoa, break that up. But it sounds like you've broken it up, but in a different way than I'm used to.
So the one test represents that the login system works, right, end to end. You probably will also want to have individual unit tests that a user has created, but this makes sure that the whole system's behaving correctly. And yeah, for distributed systems, it was a necessity that we had to build. So inside of the test, there's basically a sequence of events. So rather than in code, each line you think as being a sequence of events that you're testing in a function, imagine that your function is now each, right, so if a unit test, you're testing basically the sequence of the lines of code inside of a function. In this type of end-to-end integration test, one test represents the login system, but each sequence happens to not be a line of code, but an entire network, entire cross-device network communication. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I think so.
So I have one question. Like, and I know we've kind of now we're just getting into the system you guys have set up. So I guess my question is, what are you testing specifically on the server that is not also kind of also being tested by? So you have one device that creates a user, and then you have another device that tries to log in with that user, right? So you have this other step in the middle. What does that other step in the middle tell you that the other device successfully being able to log in with that user doesn't tell you by only doing that?
That is a good question. Well, so I work in peer-to-peer systems. So just because data is on one device doesn't necessarily mean that data is going to be on another device. So yeah, in a centralized server setup, which most people are running with a login system, then no, the second piece, or I should say the third piece of another device logging in winds up necessarily meaning that the server does have the account created. But just to explore this, there might be data on the third device, like the cell phone, that it fundamentally is not allowed to access. So there could be the salted password on the server that you're wanting to make sure that your passwords are being correctly salted or hashed or however you're storing it in a secure manner. And that you aren't able to check on the other devices, but is something maybe you want to verify on the server. Does that give a good example of why you might want to have the in-between step?
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And like I said, these would probably also be things that you are still unit testing, but this does verify it in your end-to-end stream.
The most important thing for me is that network error happens all the time, and you want the unit tests to make sure that the system behaves correctly, but you also want to understand how your system is going to react when network failures happen. Like, what happens if a user is creating an account and when they make the request to create an account, a network failure happens and something messes up. So you're able to simulate those errors in the system to make sure that you have everything. So let's kind of switch back, because we've been talking about coordination or end-to-end testing quite a bit. Yeah. Let's jump back to performance testing. And I think, was there a couple other types of tests that you guys were mentioning?
There's performance stuff. Eric, you mentioned a couple other things. I'm not doing anything with performance testing other than I guess I am using Lighthouse for some stuff. So I guess you could maybe that's performance testing.
What on earth is Lighthouse?
It's optimized for mobile. So it's a product by Google that's fairly recent for progressive web app testing.
Still in beta. It is still in beta.
Yeah. So it goes through. There's a command line interface. There's also a plugin for Chrome, and what it does basically, for us at least, is it helps us figure out what's slow, what's not, how do we optimize for offline, which is really nice. There's tests in there for testing accessibility. There's customization you can do. It's a really well thought out project. And if you look at the GitHub repo, I think it's under Google developers / Lighthouse maybe. And they're constantly, every night there's going to be like a whole bunch of commits by like all different teams. So it's a really nice project.
Definitely post the link to that, because I want to check it out.
Yeah. You know, it's pretty cool. Like some of the, like just for an example, like it tries to give you information like so for a given view, it will tell you the longest, like longest chain of requests that are being made. It does, and I don't know exactly how it does some of this stuff, but it does try to gauge how fast your app kind of gets. And that's one of the things that they're trying to help you with, is fastest to interactive. And it gives you and it's honestly, like, it is fairly arbitrary, but it gives you a score out of 100. Is one of the things. So if you are curious about it, I would definitely the Chrome extension is pretty cool, and then you can just go to any website and then run it and run Lighthouse, and it'll generate some sort of a report for that site. It also does some tests. It is for progressive web apps, so like it'll check for things like it'll check for the existence of a service worker. It'll check to it'll also do some little things like it will make sure that the site is accessible through HTTPS, and if you go and that it redirects you to HTTPS if you get in some other way. So it does some other. Again, it's all things that are tied around progressive web apps, but also in general things that are good.
Yeah, before this, they still have it actually. There's the web console you can use. There's tools in there for performance testing, and then there's a mobile console as well, where you can test for, like, we use it for SEO because we need to have, like, performance is a huge push here now, and so we need to get a lot of performance. So it's kind of, I'm wondering what they're going to do with this tool. Also, not to kind of go off the testing subject, but maybe they'll merge some tools together.
And a shout out in terms of tools, Benchmark.js specifically for testing has been a huge lifesaver for me. Just taking a couple of my API methods and putting inside of Benchmark.js has told me so much about how bad I write code, because it turns out simple things like having a callback, an anonymous function, causes the V8 engine to have to create the entire call stack and scope context for that function every single time. So as I've been testing with Benchmark.js, I've noticed that if I just pull my anonymous functions, my callbacks, into named functions and pass them directly, I get like huge performance boosts because now,
Wow.
Well, I will say that some of these are still, especially with things like that, because I agree, because that is absolutely the way it works, and I think it's really good to help you view. But a lot of those are micro benchmarks as well. So a lot of times you can get lost in the world of micro benchmarks as well.
Yes.
So I just want to caution people out there that when you are using tools like Benchmark, which are awesome, so don't waste so much time on it if especially from a front end point of view, if your users see no benefit.
It's a strong warning that people really need to be aware of. The very, very important use cases is typically for people building like web-based games, right? So there is a place where it's really, really critical. However, if you're curious about performance testing and you don't want to get lost in micro optimizations, I've developed something like TDD that I call PTSD, Performance Testing Speed Development. And I did a tech talk on it. I'll try it in a link. It lets you very, very quickly test little micro optimizations so you aren't wasting any time. But then you get back to code and slowly, because you've chosen one operation that happens to be a couple million ops faster than the other, when you add that up over the 30 minutes of you writing your code, you wind up getting like a ton of performance gains. So yes, very strong warning to people, be careful about benchmark.js and getting lost in micro optimizations, but there are strategies that you could do to attack it. And or if you are writing games, you kind of don't really have a choice.
Yeah. Games are definitely a different beast. There are different things you have to think about than if you're building a pretty standard web app. Well, I don't know about you guys, but we're starting to bump up against our time here. I think we've covered quite a bit of stuff. We've gone, all the way from kind of like the stuff that we're doing. We talked about some test-driven. We talked about some test-driven development. Got into the weeds with some stuff, which I always like. So before we sign off, does anybody have any parting thoughts or words of wisdom for our listeners?
Just keep on testing. It's worth the hassle.
Yeah, I don't know if it could be summed up much better than that, but yeah, it is absolutely worth the time that it takes. Even just for that, we talked about that kind of like that peace of mind about knowing that if you change something, knowing whether you broke something else, that's huge.
And look into testing with pair programming on OptiGrim's websites as well. I'll try and get some links for that.
Cool.
Because pair programming has helped a lot with TDD for me.
Awesome. That's really good to know. We could probably do another episode talking about pros and cons of things like pair programming. All right. Well, thank you very much, Eric, and thank you very much, Mark, for hanging out for this episode of the Web Platform Podcast. This was episode 119. Testing.